Welcome to Underwire History. Welcome to Underwire History, where we delve into the intricacies of human endeavor, driven by politics, economics, and social pressures. In 1621, Myles Standish is appointed as the first commander of Plymouth Colony, a settlement that embodies the confluence of business ventures, theological interests, and exploratory zeal. The Massachusetts Bay Company's leadership in England, comprised of influential figures like John Carver and William Brewster, entrusted Standish with overseeing the newly established colony. This appointment marked a turning point, as Standish's role would shape the governance structure and set the stage for future conflicts between Plymouth Colony and other English settlements. Standish, an experienced military officer, brought discipline and leadership to the settlement, yet his authority was not absolute. He had to navigate complex relationships with the colony's council and its inhabitants. The institutional setup of Plymouth Colony was shaped by the British Crown's charter to the Massachusetts Bay Company, which granted them the right to govern a portion of North America in exchange for their loyalty and support. This setup created a delicate balance between economic and theological ambitions, as the colonists sought to establish a new society while adhering to English law and governance structures. As the first commander, Standish's decisions would have significant implications for the colony's development, influencing its growth, interactions with Native American tribes, and ultimately its relationship with England. Myles Standish is appointed as the first commander of Plymouth Colony, unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. Central event reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. Consequences and response reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. In 1621, Myles Standish's appointment as commander of Plymouth Colony marked a significant turning point in the settlement's development. As an experienced military officer, he brought much-needed discipline and leadership to the struggling colony. Yet his authority was not absolute. He had to navigate complex relationships with the colony's council and its inhabitants, whose economic and theological ambitions often conflicted. The appointment of Myles Standish as commander of Plymouth Colony was influenced by the colony's founders, including William Bradford and John Carver. The two men had established a system of governance that would shape the decisions made by Standish and future leaders. Standish's authority was further complicated by the presence of Thomas Morton, who had previously served as the colony's lieutenant governor, but was now in opposition to the new commander. Morton's relationship with the Native American tribe, the Massachusetts, also created tension between him and Standish. The decision-making process within the colony was shaped by a complex web of interests and motivations. The Pilgrims were primarily motivated by a desire to establish a theological community, while the investors in England were driven by economic gain. Standish's role as commander had to balance these competing priorities. In 1622, the colony faced a severe drought that further strained relationships between the colonists and Native Americans. Standish responded by implementing stricter controls on the distribution of resources, which exacerbated tensions with the Massachusetts. This led to a series of skirmishes between the two groups, including an incident in which several Englishmen were killed. The consequences of these events would have far-reaching implications for the colony's relationship with England and its ability to secure support from investors. The central event of Standish's appointment had set in motion a chain reaction of decisions and responses that would ultimately shape the course of Plymouth Colony. The institutional response to the drought and skirmishes was shaped by the colony's system of governance, which included a council composed of prominent colonists. As commander, Standish worked closely with the council, but his relationship with Thomas Morton created tension within the leadership. Morton, who had previously served as lieutenant governor, began to secretly work with the Massachusetts to undermine Standish's authority and negotiate a treaty that would benefit the Native American tribe and himself. Standish's response to these developments was to request additional support from England, citing the colony's instability and his own difficulties in maintaining order. However, this request ultimately backfired as it highlighted the colony's dependence on English assistance and created resentment among the colonists, who felt that they were being treated like subjects rather than free settlers. The fallout from these events would be significant, as the relationship between the Pilgrims and their investors began to fray. Plymouth Colony's inability to secure support from England led to a decline in investment, which in turn led to a decrease in resources for the colony, further straining relationships with the Native Americans. Myles Standish's request for additional support from England had far-reaching consequences. The English investors, who had grown increasingly dissatisfied with the colony's performance, began to re-evaluate their involvement. The arrival of a new governor, John Endicott, in 1628 marked a significant turning point in the colony's fortunes. Endicott's appointment was seen as a response to Standish's struggles and the colony's growing instability. However, his tenure would prove to be tumultuous, with conflicts arising between him and the council over issues such as governance and land distribution. The tensions created by Endicott's leadership further strained relationships within the colony. The Pilgrims' desire for a more stable and secure environment was increasingly at odds with their need for English support. As the situation continued to deteriorate, the options available to the colonists narrowed. The once promising venture had become a precarious endeavor, threatened by both internal conflicts and external pressures. The consequences of these developments would be felt for years to come, shaping the course of Plymouth Colony's history in profound ways. Standish's request for additional support from England had far-reaching consequences as English investors grew increasingly dissatisfied with the colony's performance. The arrival of a new governor, John Endicott, in 1628 marked a significant turning point in the colony's fortunes. However, his tenure would prove to be tumultuous, with conflicts arising between him and the council over issues such as governance and land distribution. The tensions created by Endicott's leadership further strained relationships within the colony. As the situation continued to deteriorate, the options available to the colonists narrowed. The once promising venture had become a precarious endeavor, threatened by both internal conflicts and external pressures. In 1630, a group of English investors, led by Thomas Weston, began to take a more active role in the colony's governance. Weston's faction, which included influential figures such as William Bradford, sought to reform the colony's system of government and increase its economic viability. However, their efforts were met with resistance from Standish and other members of the council, who felt that Weston's plans would undermine their authority. The conflict between these two factions would continue to simmer in the background, influencing the colony's development for years to come. In 1631, the Massachusetts Bay Company was granted a charter by King Charles I, granting it control over a large tract of land, including Plymouth Colony. This move marked a significant shift in the balance of power within the region, as the company's influence began to eclipse that of Standish and his council. The consequences of these events would be far-reaching, shaping the course of Plymouth Colony's history and its relationship with England for generations to come. The Massachusetts Bay Company's charter had a profound impact on the governance of the colony, as it established a system of church-based government that favored the interests of the Boston clergy. This led to a sense of disenfranchisement among the Plymouth colonists, who felt their voices and needs were being ignored by the new authorities. The company's influence also brought an influx of new settlers, many of whom were driven by economic motivations rather than a desire to establish a community based on spiritual values. This shift in demographics led to increased tensions between the Plymouth colonists and the newer arrivals, who often held different views on issues such as land use and governance. In 1632, the Massachusetts Bay Company appointed William Pynchon as its agent for the region, tasked with overseeing the colony's economic development and relations with England. Pynchon's tenure was marked by controversy, including a dispute over land ownership in which he was accused of favoring his own interests over those of the company. This scandal led to increased scrutiny of Pynchon's activities and ultimately resulted in his dismissal from his position as agent. The repercussions of Pynchon's scandal extended beyond the colony itself, as it reflected broader concerns about corruption and abuse of power within the Massachusetts Bay Company. As tensions between the Plymouth colonists and the newer arrivals continued to rise, the council, led by Standish, began to lose control over the colony's governance. The Massachusetts Bay Company's influence had created a power vacuum, with various factions vying for control and favor from the company's agents in England. In 1633, the company's leaders, including Weston and Bradford, were summoned to London to answer charges of mismanagement and corruption. Their absence left the colony without effective leadership, exacerbating internal conflicts and external pressures. The colonists' economic situation continued to deteriorate, with food shortages and disease outbreaks taking a heavy toll on their numbers. In 1634, a group of Plymouth colonists, led by Standish, petitioned King Charles I for relief from the Massachusetts Bay Company's governance, citing its failure to protect their interests and well-being. Their appeal was met with skepticism in England, where the company's influence and connections made it difficult for any critic or opposition to gain traction. The consequences of this power struggle would be far-reaching, leading to further instability and conflict within Plymouth Colony and its relationship with England. The Massachusetts Bay Company's leadership in London faced intense scrutiny over the scandal surrounding William Pynchon, with allegations of corruption and abuse of power coming to a head. In 1635, King Charles I appointed a new governor for the colony, John Winthrop, who arrived in Boston with a mandate to restore order and discipline within the Massachusetts Bay Company's administration. Winthrop's appointment was seen as a significant shift in power dynamics, as he brought with him a team of experienced administrators and a clear vision for reforming the company's governance structure. However, his efforts were met with resistance from various factions within the colony, including some who felt that his reforms went too far in centralizing authority and limiting their autonomy. The conflict between these groups continued to simmer, with some colonists calling for greater independence from English rule and others advocating for a more robust role for the Massachusetts Bay Company in governing the colony. As the power struggle escalated, tensions also rose between the Plymouth colonists and the newer arrivals, who were increasingly resentful of the influence wielded by the Boston clergy over the colony's governance. In 1636, the English government passed the Navigation Act, which tightened its control over colonial trade and commerce, further exacerbating tensions within the colony. The repercussions of these developments would be felt for years to come, as Plymouth Colony struggled to assert its identity and interests in a rapidly changing world. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.